Today's video sponsor is Threat Protection, a service by NordVPN. More on them in just a bit. Imagine a real-life Hannibal Lecter who not only killed and dismembered his victims, but also served them as burgers to unsuspecting customers. Meet Joe Metheny, the notorious human burger killer who terrorized a community and left a trail of gruesome evidence. Brace yourself for a chilling account of one of the most heinous crimes in modern history and discover the disturbing psyche of a man who crossed all boundaries of humanity. Hello everybody, welcome back to another brand new episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, hello there, I'm your host Simon Wamsley here, one of my writers, Matthew. Thank you, Matthew, has written me a script. I've not read this before. Somehow, despite doing a true crime podcast for ages, like being in this world, thinking about all of this stuff, I have somehow never even heard, often I'll be like, oh, I've heard of that, like vaguely aware. I have no idea about this dude who apparently made burgers out of people, which is just like, bro, serial killer cannibal? Real life Hannibal Lecter? How have I missed this one? Anyway, let's just jump in. The format of the show, if you're new here, I've never read this before. I'm going to read it. And also Jen, wonderful video editor, edits it afterwards. Or also audio, of course, depending on how you consume this as a podcast on YouTube, whatever. Let's just jump in. On a warm summer's night in 1994, a tired and weary Joseph Metheny returned home to find his entire life in shambles. Joe was a truck driver for Joe Stein & Sons Pallet Company in Baltimore, Maryland, so he was used to being away from home for long stretches of time. But on this particular night, he had been working especially late. When he stepped through the door, he saw that his longtime girlfriend had left him, and she'd taken everything but the light bulbs. I once moved into an apartment and it did have light bulbs. And I was like, really? You couldn't have just... Rick, I know like LED light bulbs are more... This was a nice apartment. Like LED light bulbs, I get they're expensive, but did some light bulbs? Come on. This may not sound like a tragedy, considering Joe would later admit that he couldn't have cared less about his worthless girlfriends, or the furniture for that matter. However, there was something else missing, besides the boxy television set, rusted kitchen appliances, and countless piles of dirty, unsorted laundry. It was his 6-year-old son, the son that Joe had been working so hard to provide for. Joe's blood began to boil, his eyes bulged, and he twitched with anger. Normally, despite his outward appearance, Joe was a well-tempered and polite man. Standing at 6'1" and weighing over 350 pounds, Joe was a paradox. On the outside, he was a large, bald man with crooked teeth, covered in tattoos, but according to those that knew him, he was kind, mannerly, considerate. He was intelligent enough to study physics while training for service in the US Army. However, he also spent most of his life living in homeless camps and addicted to hard drugs. Yeah, well, there's the explanation, isn't there? Hard drugs. Don't do drugs. Don't get addicted. Do drugs. Drugs are fine.
What is drugs?
Just don't do I don't know. Kind of just like defending the softest of drugs here. Like, I don't think anyone, people still are, but like no one's going to like have their life ruined by smoking a little bit of pot. But yeah, hard drugs and getting addicted to them, it's not a good time. It does ruin lives. This guy studied physics and he ended up homeless. All of that is to say, like so many people, Joe Metheny was a complicated man. But on this summer night, his lifetime of drug use combined with a feeling of betrayal caused Joe to snap. He wanted to know where his girlfriend had taken their son, and he was going to do everything in his power to find them. He knew that she was addicted to crack cocaine, a habit that he himself had been working hard to kick, and that she would most likely be staying with someone who could provide it to her. After this night, Joe Metheny embarked on a murder spree that left as many as 13 people dead as he stalked the homeless camps of South Baltimore City for over 2 years. This is the story of Joe Metheny, the barbecue burger butcher. A life of struggle. Now, before we talk about Joe Metheny's past and his upcoming crime spree, there is something that you need to know. Joe Metheny is an unreliable narrator, and unfortunately, most of the details available online about his crimes are self-reported. While talking about his life, Joe often contradicted himself, sometimes even in the same sentence. Some of the things he said were probably false, while others were at one time assumed to be false, but later proven to be true. So going forward, you might be tempted to think that Joe Metheny is a liar or exaggerating his crimes as some serial killers do, but I don't think so. I think that most of his confusion comes down to one simple thing: drugs. Okay, so he might not be lying or exaggerating, but the drugs could lead him to do that inadvertently. like to exaggerate or just be confused about it or not remember or remember some things more vividly. For almost the entirety of his adult life, Joe was wasted on either alcohol, heroin, crack cocaine, or a combination of all three. Jeez, this guy was driving a truck around? Oh my god. Like crack cocaine, that just is like a... Well, no, it's methamphetamine. Meth's the one that really like makes you go, right? I don't even know what crack cocaine does to you. It's not quite like cocaine, is it? Isn't it like intense cocaine that you smoke? So I don't know if I'd feel like that's probably okay for driving a truck, but like heroin? Alcohol? No. Not that I'm saying I want truck drivers to be on crack cocaine. I'd rather they weren't. During his crime spree in particular, Joe admits that he was spending every single penny he earned on his vices and that his memories of the murders are hazy at best. To give further credit to his claims, Joe's own attorney, Margaret Mead, who was appointed to represent him at trial, once said, "I have no reason not to believe him. I've always found him to be forthright and honest. I think he's telling the truth." So in my opinion, Joe Metheny was not a liar. He was just incapable of remembering the exact details. Look, I know that we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I wanted to set the expectation as we move forward, because the timeline is somewhat complicated. Therefore, going forward, I will be presenting you with what I believe to be the proper order of events. However, where there is doubt or contradictory evidence, I will interject to tell you the other side of the story. And with that out of the way, let's start with our first point of contention, Joe's childhood. Joe Metheny was born in 1955 to Jean Metheny and a father whose name is difficult to track down. One thing we do know is that Joe's father was a severe alcoholic and he was killed in a drunk driving accident when Joe was only 6 years old. After this, his mother was given the impossible task of raising Joe and his 5 siblings alone, while also working double shifts as a waitress to keep the family finances from going under. I cannot even imagine. My wife and I have 2 kids. She doesn't work, and it's still like... And we have help, not like full time, but we have like a babysitter, and it's still like, it's still hard. 5 kids, working double shifts. I don't work double shifts. I work regular person hours. And I'm not the main like caregiver. It's crazy. I cannot imagine it. And I know people listening are like, yeah, I know someone like this. Maybe you even are this person. Good Lord, good for you. I mean, I cannot even imagine. Joe claims that he was neglected as a child and that his mother sent her children away to live in foster homes all across Northern Virginia and Maryland. This is the first disputed point, as Jean Metheny's recounting of her son's childhood paints a very different picture. She says that, other than occasional financial troubles, her children did not have a single problem in the world. They were poor, but they always had food to eat and a solid roof over their heads. It's probably somewhere in the middle, isn't it? Like, sending them away, there must be some record of that. But to not have any troubles in the world when it's a single mother working double shifts to raise 5 children is like, I'm pretty sure my kids have troubles in the world, and they have the opposite of this. In my opinion, both accounts can be true at the same time if you consider them from different perspectives. Joe's mother was a working woman who always put bread on the table and made sure that her children were not forced onto the street. However, working that many hours to provide for them also meant that she was never home to raise and nurture her children the way that a parent should. So it is very possible that Joe felt neglected while his mother did not see it that way. It's absurd that that's a statement. Like the children not force the children out onto the street. I know this was like the 1960s or whatever, but it's still America. America has been rich for a very long time. It shouldn't be happening in rich countries, guys. Children should not be on the streets in rich countries. It's just a bit, I don't know. It's not right, is it? She also claims that Joe was kind and polite child who never got into trouble. He was an above-average student, had normal childhood hobbies, and avoided getting into fights whenever possible. Joe says that his childhood was far more adventurous than the one his mother describes. I'm spilling papers everywhere. I forgot my iPad at home today, so I printed this out, and I just thought I'd read off a paper like I used to do before. I just had giant stacks of paper from all the scripts I printed out, and it just felt bad for the environment, so I just started using an iPad, but we went back to it today. It's a throwback episode. When Joe turned 18, he left home to join the army. This much is true and verifiable, but the exact details of his deployment are also disputed. His mother said that he was stationed in Germany. However, Joe told multiple people that he was actually stationed in Vietnam. He claims that his drug dependency started with heroin while living and fighting in the Vietnam jungle. As I said, there's no questioning the fact that he was in the army because official records prove that he was, but it's unlikely that he was stationed anywhere near Vietnam because, as many people online have pointed out, the US had already pulled out of the war by the time Joe entered the military and troops were no longer being stationed there. Either way, after leaving the army, Joe did not return home. Instead, he spent the next decade and a half drifting around, never really establishing himself anywhere, and choosing to live among the homeless population in various cities across the eastern seaboard. This is where his drug dependencies really started to take hold. He was already a heavy drinker, but soon he found himself needing more. He turned back to heroin and eventually crack cocaine. He attempted to maintain steady employment. However, that is almost impossible when you spend 10 hours each day passed out in a gutter and the other 14 desperately trying to score your next hit. Yeah, drugs destroy lives. And I mean, I don't know what the stats are, but there must be so much drug use that leads to homelessness, right? I mean, I know some of it is economic, but it's also situations like this. And it's like, I don't know. It's not a good situation.
Obviously, Simon, well done.
For over 15 years, Joe continued to live like this. He floated around committing crimes, acquired a few small felonies in the process, and eventually landed in South Baltimore City. Now in his late 30s, Joe met a woman. Like Joe, she was also homeless and addicted to various drugs, but when Joe found out that he had gotten her pregnant, he attempted to clean up his life to provide for them. To do this, he got his CDL, commercial driver's license, and started to truck for a pallet company called Joe Stein & Sons. At this point, Joe seemed like he was really trying to turn his life around. I'm not sure exactly where his family was living, but at the very least, he claims that it was a house and not some tent down by the river. Unfortunately, neither he nor his girlfriend could completely kick their drug habits, and on that fateful day in 1994, when Joe's son was 6 years old, she left him to score drugs with another man. This destroyed Joe and marked the start of the complete collapse of his mental health. The long night. To find his son, Joe spoke with friends, drug dealers, and work acquaintances, but nobody had heard from either of them. Since stalking his ex-girlfriend had become his obsession, Joe quit his job and dove headfirst back into the world of drugs, so there would be nothing to hold him back. After injecting or smoking his remaining money, Joe had no way to pay his bills and once again found himself homeless. He moved back into one of the homeless camps that he'd been living in previously, a spot known as Tent City, and began questioning people in the few hours of each day that he was able to stay conscious. After months of searching, Joe learns that both his ex-girlfriend and her new man had been arrested for possession of drugs, and that his son had been taken by the state of Maryland and placed into foster care. With multiple felony convictions and his own drug habit once again weighing him down, Joe was convinced that no judge would ever release his son into his custody, which is a fairly acute observation there if you're homeless and the kid's in foster care. Foster care is not brilliant. It's not where you want kids to be, but if I were the judge, I'd make exactly that call. Now, at this point, any rational person might decide that the best thing to do is clean yourself up, find steady employment, and work your ass off to prove the judge that you are a reliable father. However, at this point in his life, Joe was not a rational person. In Joe's mind, his son was lost to him forever, and there was nothing he could do to change that. So, if he couldn't have his son, he wanted the next best thing. Joe decided he was going to murder his ex-girlfriend and the drug-pushing piece of who cost him his family. Joe asked the man where his ex was staying, and he was informed that the pair were headed to the Hanover Street Bridge to buy more drugs and to get high. Infuriated and seeing his chance to act, Joe grabbed an axe, which was occasionally used by the camp for self-defense against rival homeless gangs. He set off into the night after smoking some more crack, that is. When Joe arrived at the Hanover Street Bridge, he found two men, Randall Brewer and Randy Piker. Both were passed out on an old rotting mattress, high beyond belief and unintelligible. Joe quickly woke them and began grilling them for answers. He learned that these two men had gotten high with his ex-girlfriend, but they told Joe that the couple must have left after they had passed out. Furious, Joe raised the axe and brought the blunt end of it down onto the men's heads repeatedly. He left their bodies on the mattress, where they had just been sleeping. That same night, underneath that same bridge, Joe lured, interrogated, and killed two separate sex workers who he falsely believed could lead him to his real targets. However, instead of leaving them out in the open like he did with Randall and Randy, he decided to toss their bodies into the nearby Patapsco River. While disposing of them, Joe claims that he was spotted by a dock worker working the midnight shift. He confronted the man and then beat him to death with a steel pipe. The man's body was also thrown into the river. After about 7 straight hours of hunting, interrogating, and murdering his 5 victims, Joe Metheny waded into the waters of the Patapsco at dawn and washed their blood from his body and clothes. He then washed and returned the axe to the homeless camp. He found a nice pile of trash to use as a pillow and fell deeply into a drug-induced slumber. So this dude went from regular... Drugs are a hell of a thing. He went from pretty much just regular trucking dude to having this mental break, smoke some drugs, and then murdered 4 people. Was it 4 or 5? In one night? From nothing? Jesus. Don't do crack.
Stop it. Get some help.
Oh my lord. Murder after murder. For the next few weeks, Joe continued to search for his ex-girlfriend all across South Baltimore. However, unfortunately for Joe, his drug-fueled night of revenge eventually landed him inside a holding cell after police discovered Randall and Randy's bodies atop the old mattress. How did they tie this together? Unfortunately for the victims, because it had taken the police over 3 weeks to discover their bodies. Oh my, 3 weeks? Much of the evidence that tied Joe to the murders had already been lost or contaminated. This included the murder weapon, as on August 2nd, 1995, another homeless man, Larry Amos, had used the self-defense axe to murder another homeless man, Everett Dowell, underneath the same Hanover Street bridge. It wasn't until police began investigating this new murder that the bodies of Randall and Randy were even discovered. Larry Amos was then arrested and charged with first-degree murder, but that charge would later be reduced to manslaughter. He was given 8 years in prison. Feels a bit light for America in murder, of which he only served 1 year and 9 months. He murdered somebody he's literally an axe murderer. Use that shockingly light sentence as a barometer for how much police and judges actually care about the lives of homeless people. Good Lord. Although Joe did spend the next year in jail awaiting trial, he was eventually acquitted and released back onto the streets. It's also mad that a dude can spend a year in jail awaiting trial and then be acquitted. That's insane. You just get arrested for something, obviously not in this case, but let's say you're innocent. They arrest you. You wait a year in jail awaiting trial? How is that fair? What is going on? Joe was now a charge-free and drug-free man, but the latter would not last long. He had been forced to get clean while in jail due to the low supply on the inside, but as soon as the first opportunity presented itself, he was back on heroin. Let me tell you today about our fantastic sponsor, and that would be Threat Protection, a service provided by, a longtime sponsor of the show, someone you've heard of, NordVPN. Threat Protection by NordVPN is the perfect lightweight companion to keep your data and devices safe online. It protects up to 6 devices for the price of just 1 subscription, which is useful. I don't know if I quite have 6 devices, but I'll regularly travel with 3: phone, iPad, laptop. Then I've got 2 other computers. So I'm like 1 away from 6. So I see where I feel like I'm quite a tech-heavy person. You can automatically block access to their database of over 1 million known malicious websites. Oh my god, there's a lot of bad people out there. Scan downloading files for malware, and it's also able to delete them before their contents have any chance of doing harm to your system. It blocks annoying ads on Windows, Mac, and even while browsing in incognito. All very handy stuff. So, you can get an exclusive deal on Threat Protection today. Just go to nordsecurity.com/casualcriminalist. That's nordsecurity.com/casualcriminalist. It's risk-free. You'll get a 30-day money-back guarantee. And like I say, there's an exclusive deal over there. So go check it out one more time. nordsecurity.com/casualcriminalist. Thank you, Nord. And now back to today's video. With his name cleared, Joe returned to his old job site at Stein & Sons Pallet Company and convinced his bosses to rehire him. Because his boss had a habit of hiring mostly reformed felons, Joe Metheny was brought back on board as a forklift driver and paid a measly $7 per hour. With nowhere else to stay and not wanting to return to the homeless camp, Joe requested to use the trailer located at the rear of the pallet company's property as a home. He offered to be the property's night watchman in return, and his bosses agreed. The trailer, which was small, dirty, and collapsing into itself, was located at the rear of the Steins & Sons property and surrounded by tall trees. A chain-link fence and stacks of old broken pallets separated the trailer from the nearby main road. It wasn't much, but Joe quickly made it his home. Yeah, it's not bad for something totally free. Well, my expectations really low. It's like, all I gotta do is watch the property at night and you can live there for free. That sounds like quite a good deal, even though it's a dump. If you were homeless previously, that's a hell of an upgrade. A lot had changed for Joe Metheny over the past year, but one thing that remained the same was his hatred for his ex-girlfriend and his desire to see her dead. But despite his best efforts, Joe was never able to find her again. She had simply vanished, and Joe hoped that meant she was dead. Still, his anger lived on, and one night while cruising through South Baltimore City, Joe spotted a woman that he vaguely recognized. Her name was Kathy, and she was dressed in a pair of cut-off jeans, a white pullover sweater, and white tennis shoes. She carried a purse over her shoulder. This was 45-year-old Catherine Ann Magaziner. She was a sex worker who had spent years on the streets and was addicted to multiple hard drugs. She wasn't Joe's ex-girlfriend, but she reminded Joe of her. He rolled down his window and called to her. She looked at him and offered a smile that revealed multiple missing teeth. She approached the car, and Joe asked her if she would like to join him in his trailer. He made promises of money and drugs, and she agreed. Inside his trailer, Joe and Kathy had sex, and then, while she lay half-clothed and high out of her mind on Joe's mattress, he lunged at her and strangled her with a nearby extension cord. She was too far gone to put up any significant fight, although even if she had been in her right mind, a frail 130-pound woman wouldn't have stood a chance against the massive Joe Metheny. What comes next requires its own separate content warning for anyone eating. Oh god, or maybe just anyone doing anything. This is about to get grim, isn't it? Because it's an episode about a dude who turned people into burgers.
What kind of hamburgers?
Cheeseburgers.
On the floor of his trailer, Joe proceeded to desecrate her corpse by harvesting as much muscle tissue as he could from the meatiest parts of her body. He stored this meat in Tupperware containers inside his freezer, and after disposing of the remainder of her body in a shallow grave in the forest behind his trailer, he seasoned this meat, cooked it, covered it in sauce, and ate it. This dude has lost his mind. Drugs have made this dude lose his mind. I don't believe he was born this way. Something snapped, like that combination of his girlfriend's taking his son away and the drugs. Something went wrong, like his brain got broken, and now he's insane. He claims he doesn't know why he ate her, he just did. Months later, he would return to her grave and further desecrate her body by cutting it into 7 pieces and reburying each piece separately. A head was taken back inside the trailer, thrown in a box, and left to rot. Eventually, he disposed of it off-site, and it was never recovered. In the weeks following her death, Joe found that he was unsatiated with simply eating her himself. He gathered the supplies he would need to open a street-side barbecue cart, fashioned a handwritten makeshift sign, and ground up small amounts of her frozen remains into fresh beef and pork. He rolled this mixture into patties and loaded them into his food cart. Then, as unsuspecting people went about their day, he served them this rancid meat. They ate it without ever knowing what they were consuming. When asked about the food cart, Joe laughed and admitted, "I opened up a little open-pit beef stand. I had real roast beef and pork sandwiches. They were very good. The human body taste was very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell." Oh, that is not right. This did not stop with Kathy. Joe continued to lure homeless sex workers into his home by providing them with drugs. He killed them, harvested meat from their bodies, then dumped them all around Baltimore. He claims to have killed at least 10 women in this way, but due to the way homeless people go unreported, police were not even aware that they were missing. On November the 11th, 1996, Joe lured Kimberly Spicer to his trailer and attempted to sexually assault her with a beer bottle. She fought back, and Joe stabbed her 26 times in the face and neck. He then dragged her body to the woods behind his trailer and tossed it in the bushes. On December the 8th, 1996, Joe lured another woman, 37-year-old Rita Kemper, into his trailer, just as he did with the other women. Rita knew Joe fairly well, as they had been using crack cocaine together for many years, but Rita was clear that she was not interested in Joe sexually. That night, while high, Joe ordered Rita to remove her clothes. Rita resisted, and Joe hit her twice. While hitting her, he laughed and said, "I'm going to kill you and bury you in the woods with the other girls." Ooh. During their scuffle, Rita was able to slip out the door. However, Joe caught her and pulled her back inside. As he was removing her clothes, she managed to slip through an open window and make it to the chain-link fence that separated the Steins and Sons property from the nearby Washington Avenue. She then scaled the fence, cutting herself badly on the razor wire, and dropped down onto the ground on the other side. Joe Metheny watched helplessly as the first victim he had ever let escape flagged down a passing truck and disappeared into the night. This better be the end of it. Please tell me she goes to the police go to his trailer, they look in the bushes and find all the desecrated corpses, and then he goes to prison forever and maybe gets a needle in his arm. Although he is insane. Oh, he's insane, isn't he? I mean, yes, he's a murderer, but he's obviously not in his right mind. He's not like, he was a regular dude and something snapped in his brain and now his brain is broken. Oof. A small complication. After Rita Kemper's escape, Joe braced for the worst. He was sure that she would go to the police, but for some reason, possibly because she was a homeless sex worker, Rita did not immediately report Joe's attempted sexual assault. I wouldn't be so worried about reporting the sexual assault, which obviously do, but also report the fact that he said, "I'm going to kill you and bury you in the woods with the other girls." That is, there's also that. Still, Joe had no way of knowing this, and he was paranoid that she would eventually bring the police to his doorstep, so he began trying to hide the evidence. Joe gathered Catherine's belongings, her clothes, and her purse, and buried them far away from his own trailer so that if discovered, they might not be linked to her body. A couple of days later, Joe and a fellow co-worker named Clint Ashbrook were sitting inside Joe's trailer drinking whiskey and snorting lines of cocaine off Joe's dirty, dilapidated furniture. As Joe became increasingly intoxicated, his secrets began to spill, and eventually he revealed to his friends that he needed help with something important. He needed help moving a body. Clint thought that Joe was trying to pull a prank on him and agreed to follow Joe outside where he said that the body was located. As they approached the forested area behind his home, Joe began heaving away a pile of trash, leaves, and debris until Clint could plainly see the body of Kimberly Spicer lying in the dirt. By this point, she was bloated and covered in maggots. He told Clint that he wanted to throw the body into a nearby dumpster, but he didn't give him an exact reason why. At that point, I'd be like, okay, Joe, it seems you got a body here. Let's definitely move this body together and everything is fine. And then at the first opportunity, I would escape because Joe's massive. And I would assume that if I said, bro, what have you done? You've killed someone, that Joe is going to kill me. Play along, escape, go to the police as soon as possible. Joe then grabbed a tarp and began rolling the body onto it and once again asked for Clint's help. Clint claims that in that moment he was terrified of the much larger man and didn't want to set him off. However, he still refused to help by claiming that he had something else to do and that he would help some other time.
It's like, yeah, no, Joe, I'll definitely come back. We'll definitely deal with this body. I just have to return some videotapes and then I'll be back and we can do this.
Clint then left Joe by himself and sped off on his motorcycle, which some newspaper articles hilariously refer to as a bicycle, but for some unknown reason he returned an hour later with a peace offering of more cocaine. Clint says that when he arrived back at Joe's trailer, Joe was relieved to see that he hadn't gone to the police. He also said that Joe was sweaty and out of breath because he had moved the body himself. The two men then proceeded to party late into the night, drinking beer and doing cocaine until both men fell asleep on the floor of Joe's collapsing trailer. Clint, what are you up to?
You're making the bad decision.
It's like, instead of going to the VC, go to buy him coke. Clint, what is wrong with you? What's wrong with you? You're just getting yourself... This is like, drugs are one thing, but you're just becoming an accessory to a big crime here, Clint. The next morning, Joe acted as if nothing had happened the previous night, and Clint was left wondering if the man could even remember what he had asked him to do. That morning, when Joe and Clint's bosses, Joe Stein Sr. and Joe Stein Jr. arrived for work, Clint sat them down and told them all about the previous night. Joe Stein Sr. ordered Clint not to tell anyone about what he had seen. Joe Stein Sr., what are you up to? Now, I'm not a business owner, but I feel like maybe if I were a business owner and one of my employees had murdered someone and buried them on my property, I would definitely call the police and tell them that one of my employees had buried a body on the property. Yes, Matthew, because you are a regular person with a functioning brain. Why Joe Stein Sr. did not immediately go to the police was a mystery to me. However, I quickly discovered that Stein & Sons Pallet Company had a great many skeletons in their own closet. Oh my god, are they doing crimes themselves? They're like transporting drugs or people or something, like Pallet Company. What's on those pallets, Joe? Joe's? Oh, God. It turns out Joe Stein Sr., who I'll be referring to Stein Sr. for the sake of clarity and brevity, was a man with an extensive criminal background, multiple felonies, and a history of drug dealing and gun trafficking. Oh my God, these are big-ass crimes. Gun trafficking? At the time of Joe Metheny's murder spree, Stein & Sons Pallet Company was under investigation by the FBI as part of an organized crime sting. Stein's company had been engaging in corporate fraud and the trafficking of stolen goods. Do you want to throw any more crimes in there? Good lord. I promise I'm not making this up. My jaw nearly hit the keyboard the moment I realized that I had accidentally stumbled into an organized crime story as well. Now you ready for the real kicker? Stein Jr. was working as an informant for the FBI against his own father. Wait, is Joe Metheny the story today, or is it the Stein family?
You want to suck my
what he said to his son.
Oh my god! The son in Stein & Sons had flipped for immunity from prosecution and been wearing a wire for months as the FBI slowly gathered evidence against his father. Stein Sr. did not want Clint to go to the police because he knew that they would find much more than a body if they investigated the pallet company's property. Unfortunately, on the morning that Clint revealed his discovery to Stein Sr. and Stein Jr., Stein Jr. was not wearing his wire and did not capture the confession. However, Stein Jr. did put Clint in contact with his FBI FBI handler so that Clint would not get in trouble for failing to report Metheny's crimes to the police. Later that day, while Joe Metheny was away from his trailer, Stein Jr. went to the back of the property and began looking around. Amid the stack of broken pallets and heaping piles of trash, Stein found a small opening that led underneath Joe's trailer. When he crawled inside on his hands and knees, he came face to face with the rotting corpse of Kimberly Spicer. Now, you might be asking yourself, what are the odds that Joe Metheny just happened to find himself employed and living on the property of someone under investigation for organized crime? I mean, it's not out of this world impossible, is it? Well, if Stein Jr. and Clint Ashbrook are to be believed, and I don't have any reason to doubt their testimony, Joe Metheny was complicit in Stein Sr.'s crimes and was acting as the Stein family's enforcer. Joe Metheny was the muscle, the fixer, the person that Stein Sr. sent to do the family's dirty work. That kind of makes sense, seeing as he doesn't seem like he'd be a very successful truck driver, given the insane amount of drugs that he seems to be taking. Joe Metheny wasn't just a man on drugs who killed sex workers who resembled his ex-girlfriend. He was the Luca Brasi to Joseph Stein's Corleone family. That's a Godfather reference, Simon. Yeah, I haven't seen The Godfather.
What have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully?
Anyway, let's move on. Taking a breather. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are two reasons why I did not mention Joe Metheny's ties to organized crime up to this point. First, no one, including Joe himself, has ever officially tied Joe Metheny to the crimes of Stein and Sons. No charges were ever filed against him, and despite having ample opportunity and displaying an eagerness to confess, Joe never talked about or admitted to anything that Stein Jr. or Clint Ashbrook alleged. That means that even if we had wanted to tell you about Joe Metheny's specific crimes, I wouldn't have been able to give you any details beyond what he may have been involved with by association. Without fully jumping into speculation, all I can say for certain is that Joe Metheny was tasked with guarding the Stein and Sons property by acting as its night watchman. That is all that he has ever confessed to. Second, I wanted you, the audience and Simon, to feel just a tiny fraction of the shock that the FBI agents must have felt when they learned that they had inadvertently stumbled into a full-on serial killer while investigating something completely unrelated. I have to say that, yes, it's a shocking reveal, sure, but also criminals are going to work like criminals attract criminals. The fact that they hired this guy to be their enforcer, he's an enforcer. He literally does violence to enforce stuff for crimes, and he turns out to be a murderer? It's like, yeah, okay. That doesn't seem super surprising to me. Sure, it's a little bit of a coincidence. Okay, it's a medium-sized coincidence. Am I being unreasonable with that? Is that way less common than I think it is, that just criminals get up to criminally stuff together? I mean, can you imagine how Stein Jr.'s FBI handler must have felt when a random man approached him and said, "Hey, Mr. FBI man, your mole just outed himself to me, and I've got a hell of a secret to tell you." So with that out of the way, how does this affect the information that you have so far? Well, as I said when talking about Joe and his mother's separate recollections of Joe's childhood, two things can be true at once, and I believe that this is another example of that. Joe Metheny was a man who was driven to madness by losing his son, but he also worked for a shady boss and may have participated in far more crimes than we may ever know. Really, at this point, the only thing that needs to be amended about Joe Metheny's life story is the fact that his boss was involved in organized crime, but based on the reaction of Stein Sr. and Stein Jr. when Clint revealed the body to them, it's unlikely that anyone else at Stein and Sons were remotely aware of what Joe was doing during his off hours. So, from this point on, I will only be giving you the facts as we talk about how the FBI sorted through this absolute mess. The arrest of Joe Metheny. This new revelation by Clint Ashbrook lit a fire at the FBI. Up till this point, they had been taking their time to ensure that they had enough evidence to convict everyone involved. However, because of this new complication, they were forced to accelerate their investigation. This was due to the very real fear that Joe Metheny would kill again. They also didn't want to give Stein Sr. the opportunity to destroy any vital evidence before they could move in and make the arrests. On December the 15th, 1996, at 1:40 a.m., Joe Metheny and Stein Sr. were arrested while exiting the company's Christmas party. Joe did not resist. He did not put up a fight. He seemed like he had already come to terms with his arrest before they even slapped the cuffs on him. With their two main targets now in custody, the FBI proceeded to round up the grunts. One employee was arrested and later convicted for arson for burning down 2 trucks that belonged to a rival company. He was given 10 years in prison. 2 others were convicted of theft of merchandise, and Clint Ashbrook was also convicted of arson for a separate offense. Stein Sr. was charged and later pled guilty to 1 count of possession of stolen firearms and 1 count of destruction of property by fire. He also pled guilty to 1 count of aiding and abetting for his attempt to cover up Joe Metheny's crimes. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Stein Jr. and the other members of the Stein family who had cooperated with the FBI were relocated for their own protection. On the night of their arrests, many employees found themselves in hot water, but Joe Metheny's water was boiling. He was separated from the rest of the group and transported to the homicide unit of the Baltimore City Police Department. He's like, okay, I'm getting arrested for being an enforcer and all that stuff. I hope they don't discover the bodies in there. And then you get transferred to the murder department. And you're like, oh no. Where are the other guys? Why are they not here as well? Do you guys... Is it about the... Busted. When Joe was interrogated about the women who had been found underneath his trailer, investigators were shocked by what came next. Joe Metheny confessed. They assumed that he would lawyer up, shut his mouth, and say nothing like he did when he was arrested for the murders of Randall Brewer and Randy Piker, but Joe seemed to already know that he was sunk. He didn't hold back. He answered every single question asked of him by both the FBI and the local police. Joe confessed to the murders of Catherine Magaziner and Kimberly Spicer, as well as the slaying of Randall Brewer and Randy Piker. He confessed to the kidnapping and attempted rape of Rita Kemper, and then went on to confess to another 8 murders. During questioning, investigators asked Joe why he had killed Kimberly Spicer, and he responded, sense of power. I don't know. Vulnerable. I dread it. I got a rush out of it. I got a high out of it. Call it what you want. I had no real excuse why, other than I liked to do it. I don't know how to describe it. At first, they weren't sure whether or not to believe him, so they asked Joe to take them to the bodies. At this point during my research, I stumbled across a rather familiar name. During one of my recent videos for Into the Shadows, that's another YouTube channel that I host, by the way, check it out, I talked about body farms. Now, scientists use donated corpses to study human decomposition and perfect body recovery techniques. The pioneer of this field, Dr. William Bass, and his students placed corpses into an open field in Knoxville, Tennessee, to study how the elements affect decomposition speed. One of Dr. Bass's students that I mentioned by name was William Rodriguez. In the 1980s, Rodriguez was just another student. However, now, in this story, he's William C. Rodriguez III, Ph.D. He's also the leader of the forensics team charged with excavating the areas that Joe Metheny pointed out to his investigators. There's a fun little coincidence there that has just come up in one of my other videos. After hearing Joe describe where exactly he left the body of Catherine Magaziner, dogs were brought in to aid in the search. However, nothing was immediately recovered. Frustrated, investigators transported Joe to the location that he had specified, but Joe quickly amended his statement. Catherine was the woman who Joe had dug up and reburied multiple times. Now, standing at one of her many temporary resting places, Joe remembered the correct spot. Joe then gave them a new location, and Rodriguez and his team were able to find and unearth Catherine's skeletal remains. Just as Joe had confessed, he had dismembered and buried her in multiple locations throughout the woods. Rodriguez was able to find all of her remains, save for the cranium, which would never be recovered. Using the teeth of the body's lower mandible, he was able to confirm that the body did indeed belong to Catherine. Joe was transported to and from jail to various locations where he thought police might find more victims, but unfortunately, no more were ever recovered or identified. Dive teams were brought in to help locate the bodies that had been dumped into the Patasco River, but this too yielded no results. Joe had said he used rocks to weigh down the bodies, but the police believed that they were not heavy enough and had have likely been carried out to sea. Trial and death. With a confession in hand, Joe Metheny was charged with the kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder of Rita Kemper. At some point between pointing the police to the burial sites of his victims and going to trial, Joe changed his mind about confessing because initially he entered a plea of not guilty. Joe's lawyer petitioned the court to have his initial confession and cooperation thrown out, but the judge denied the request and essentially told him, too little too late. Can't you retract a confession though? Isn't that something you could do? It's like, no, that was a lie. But then it would still be a part of the court, and the jury would be like, bro,
Why'd you say it then?
why'd you just spin that story? And then you got to fight that. But if it's just never in there in the first place, then they never get to hear it, which is obviously different when they're making their jury decisions. In the end, Joe was convicted of kidnapping and sexual assault charges. However, the jury acquitted him of attempted murder because there wasn't enough evidence to prove motive. Wow. There were all the bodies. Apparently shouting, "I'm going to kill you and bury you in the woods with the other girls" is not enough. For the charges he was convicted of, the judge sentenced him to 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Next, in August of 1998, Joe was put on trial for the murder and robbery of Kimberly Spicer, the woman he had dismembered, buried, dug up, decapitated, reburied, and eaten. Oh, okay, so I'm sorry, that was just one of the things. So this is, there's other bodies and other murder trials. In another episode of The Casual Criminalist, titled The Bizarre Case of Paul Powell, Danny talks extensively about the death penalty in Virginia and how certain circumstances can elevate the crime of murder to aggravated murder. To keep from rehashing that discussion and boring long-time viewers, I will keep things simple by saying that if someone commits murder while engaging in another crime such as sexual assault, robbery, or any other atrocious felony, their charge can be raised from first-degree murder to aggravated murder in the first degree. And Matthew's about to say that that can have the death penalty attached to it. This means that, per the laws of Maryland in 1998, had Joe simply murdered Spicer and left her body to be found by the police, he would only have been eligible for life in prison. But because he had robbed her, stripped her naked in the process, and stolen her purse, his crimes were elevated, and he became eligible for the death penalty. At his trial, Joe begged for death. While testifying, he turned to the jury, looking each of them in the eye as he spoke, and said, "The words, 'I'm sorry,' will never come out, for they would be a lie. I am more than willing to give up my life for what I have done, to have God judge me and send me to hell for eternity." On November the 13th, 1998, Joe's request was granted and he was sentenced to death for the murder of Kimberly Spicer. Unfortunately for Joe and fans of the death penalty, I just feel he was not in his right mind. I mean, I feel like more needed to be established about whether he was an enforcer and stuff and whether he had this other violent history, or was it just that his brain snapped from too much drugs and his son being taken away, and he just lost his mind? Did they not even try that as a defense? Unfortunately for Joe and fans of the death penalty, the sentence was later overturned in the early 2000s and reduced to life in prison without possibility of parole. This happened after it was decided that the act of burying Spicer's clothing was an attempt to hide her identity, not that the murder was the result of a robbery. As far as the law is concerned, these are two distinctly different acts. God, that's such a weird law, isn't it? Joe was then convicted of murdering Catherine Magaziner, and all other charges against him were dropped once this sentence was handed down, as there was simply not enough evidence to convict him of any other crimes. One case in particular involved a woman named Toni Lynn Ingrazier, and although police were almost certain that Joe was involved in her death, they couldn't prove it. Tony's father was told that he would have to be satisfied with and share in the justice that was reached during the other girls' trials. After his death sentence was overturned, Joe transferred to the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, where he lived until his death on August the 5th, 2017 at the age of 62. And that's where we end today's episode. That was a grim one. I have to say, I thought there would be more bodies cutting up and turned into burgers, and I was relieved it was just a very short section because, oh my. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy this show, please do leave it a review. If you're listening as a podcast, if you're on YouTube, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.